Disneyland. I only have to say that one word and your mind is already conjuring up images of the iconic castle set against an endless blue sky, of Mickey Mouse and his merry band of costumed characters skipping around the park, of fast rides, fireworks, mouse ear-shaped food, and kids making core memories. But just beneath the surface, there's a whole other world going on in the happiest place on Earth. Once the park empties out for the night and all that's left are the night shift cast members closing down and cleaning up, this other, altogether more paranormal world makes its presence known. Ask any cast member who spent time in the park until the early hours, and they'll probably have a ghost story or two to tell you. But there's one particular character that seemingly appears in every corner of the park, perhaps unsurprisingly, because the ghost of Walt Disney himself is said to continue to roam around his beloved Disneyland long after his death. It really seems to be no secret that Disneyland is apparently haunted by Walt Disney. I mean, it makes perfect logical sense, doesn't it? Disneyland was his pride and joy. It was a way for his audiences to step into the world of the animations that they were creating. And so that's why I'm really not shocked that the reports of paranormal activity involving Walt pretty much started immediately after his death, and then continue to this day. But you know me, you know what I'm like, and if you don't know me, first of all, hi, but I've always got to go sticking my nose into the history. So we got to go all the way back to get the whole story of how Disneyland went from farmland to potentially one of the most haunted spots in the USA, right? Because while Walt and his older brother Roy were working on the animations to delight the public with at the time during the 20s and 30s, Walt Disney was already thinking bigger picture. Because tourists were coming to the studios in Hollywood hoping to get a glimpse of the magic. But it's kind of that you don't want to see how the sausage is made. It was just some very talented animators working in a studio. Not really much to look at, and certainly not living up to this enchanting vision that people had in their heads. So by about 1940, Walt had started stewing on how he could connect the audience with the magic straight from the source. Initially, it was just going to be a corner of the studio where guests could meet their favourite characters, maybe get a bit of a behind-the-scenes tour, but our Walt, he doesn't do things by halves, in case you hadn't noticed. Eventually, the plans grew and grew, until Walt was envisioning a huge 100-acre park. They found the perfect place to build this park, in a patch of 200 acres of orange and walnut groves in Anaheim, California. So it was a little bit bigger than his initial plan, but turns out they would need the space. They broke ground on the 16th of July 1954, with Walt being adamant that the park would be open in 1 year on the 17th of July 1955, which they said it couldn't be done, especially with how ambitious the project was growing to be. By the end of construction, Walt had taken to staying overnight in the apartment above the newly built fire station on Main Street, USA, just so he could oversee things, make sure everything was coming together like he imagined it. Opening day, 17th of July rolled around, and it was rocky, but I mean, this huge, great big amusement park had been thrown up in one singular year. By the end of it, construction crews were working around the clock to get things done in time. I think you could be forgiven for a few teething problems, right? Obviously, not everything was completely sorted. There were some areas that were still unfinished. To be fair, some of the things that were unfinished were like pretty big things, like the tarmac, or asphalt for my American friends, that had been laid down Main Street. That had only been laid down that morning. And with the hot temperatures of the day, it had kind of started to melt. They'd also run out of food and water for all of the guests, but that was also because there were way more people than they had expected there to be. Even with all that though, I think the press were a little unfair to go as far as to call the opening day Black Sunday. I think that's a bit dramatic, but it clearly didn't put anyone off. They welcomed their 1 millionth visitor to the park less than 2 months after opening. That averages out to tens of thousands of visitors every single day. Clearly they were onto something here. At first, Disneyland featured 5 lands, so they were Frontierland, Adventureland, Fantasyland and Tomorrowland, as well as Main Street USA. Throughout the next 11 years, Walt Disney lived and breathed Disneyland. He would always be around overseeing things, checking in on the guests, making sure they were having a good time, as well as checking in on the cast members too, like he cared just as deeply about them. But unfortunately, years of chain smoking finally caught up to him, and he passed away from lung cancer on the 15th of December 1966, age 65. Since the time of Walt Disney, the park has obviously expanded and changed, with new lands added like New Orleans Square, Critter Country, Mickey's Toontown, and Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. And Disneyland, it's just such a recognisable thing, isn't it? It's obviously still just as popular, if not more so nowadays, with millions of visitors each year. It's just got this brilliantly sunny, welcoming feel for kids and big kids to relive their childhoods, make new memories, all that good stuff. But it seems like for some visitors and cast members, especially if they're working the later shifts, Walt Disney may still be around to check in on them. And don't you worry, Disneyland is allegedly super duper ridiculously haunted, so I will be releasing more parts to this story which cover specific places in the park. But today I'm just going to be sharing the weird encounters that guests and cast members have reported, which gave them the feeling like Big Man Walt was possibly still around his beloved park. And I'm starting in the place where Walt Disney spent a lot of his time before the park was even opened, and then obviously afterwards to stay close by, and that's his apartment above the fire station in Town Square on Main Street. A lot of people talk about the oil lamp in the window, and it's kind of become Disney lore at this point, because the story went that whenever Walt was in residence in the apartment, cast members would know because this particular lamp would be lit. So they know, right, okay, the boss is around, best behaviour kind of thing. And so nowadays they keep this lamp lit to kind of symbolise that Walt is still around. He's still here in the park. It's a nice little tribute to him. Well, it is disputed a lot online about this particular lamp, as it can't have been this exact lamp that Walt had, because the one that's in the window now wasn't manufactured until 1991, and that the whole thing about having the lamp lit while he was staying there wasn't like a rule that he had to follow. But I think it stemmed more from that if you see the lights on in the apartment, it's pretty safe to assume that Walt Disney is staying there that night, because why would you walk around your own apartment in the dark? But aside from that, it does apparently have a ghost story attached to it. After Walt passed away, there was a member of the maintenance crew up there doing some cleaning, and she was just going about her chores and noticed that the lamp was still on, so just thought nothing of it and switched it off, because I think straight after his death they hadn't been leaving the lamp on, like that wasn't a thing at that point. But anyway, she turned it back off, and then that was it for her. She was done, so she locked up, and that was that. She just so happened to turn and look back at the fire station as she was walking away and noticed this oil lamp was back on. Okay, odd. I've literally just turned it off, and I know I have, but okay. So she went back in, turned it off, and proceeded to lock back up again. Once she was outside, she again looked back at the window, and what do you know? That oil lamp is sitting there lit yet again. So again, she went back inside, turned it off, but just waited there for a sec, just to see if someone was going to come out of a hiding place and turn it back on, like maybe someone was pranking her or whatever. But as she was stood watching the oil lamp, completely alone, she saw the lamp reignite right in front of her eyes. And I don't know, the skeptic in me says that maybe the lamp wasn't properly extinguished, but then the other part of me that wants to believe says, well, maybe Walt is in residence that evening. Who knows? But the story goes on to say that after that, it was never switched off again. But when I say that the lamp turning on might have been because Walt was returned to his apartment, it's because there are, allegedly, other weird goings on here. It's really not uncommon for people to go up to the apartment and often comment that they can feel Walt's presence. Whether that's paranormal or not, I don't really know. It's kind of giving me Elvis Presley and Graceland vibes. Like, you can feel Walt's presence in this apartment because it's still been maintained almost exactly how it was when he would stay there. So it feels like you could just all of a sudden see him walk into the room at any moment, you know? But cast members have claimed that the curtains will open and close all on their own. Some people say that they have even witnessed the apparition of Walt Disney standing in the window looking out at Town Square. It's also said that late at night, once the guests have gone home and the park is closed for the day, if you're downstairs in the fire station, you might hear footsteps and knocking sounds coming from that apartment, even though you know for a fact there's no one up there. But the staircase behind this apartment as well is also potentially a hotspot where you might encounter something a bit weird, because it was on this staircase where Walt Disney would often retreat to have a smoke, because he didn't want the kids visiting Disneyland to see him smoking. It doesn't kind of fit with the whole wholesome image that he was trying to portray to them, so he would hide out of sight from visitors. Apparently, there are security staff who even now on a nightly basis will smell this cigarette smoke coming from that area, and it is so strong that newer security crew will go back there trying to catch the person, whoever it is, that's smoking. Like, that's how strong and intense this smell is, but they'll never come across anyone, and so a lot of people think that it is potentially Walt himself sneaking another smoke break, or at the very least a residual haunting from one of his many cigarettes enjoyed back there. And I think, yeah, that's totally believable, especially as a residual echo or something, but obviously it is up to you to decide what you believe. But that phenomenon is going to be quite a common theme throughout this story, this mention of cigarette smoke, because Walt Disney was such a heavy smoker. It was such a huge part of his life, really, no matter how much he hid it from the kids. It is interesting, but it makes perfect sense that this part of his life has now seemingly come back and is said to be an indication suggestion that his presence is around you, or at least an echo from the time when he was alive, a more residual haunting is occurring. But when he's not hanging around his old apartment, Mr. Disney is still potentially keeping just as watchful an eye on his park in death as he did in life, because cast members have sometimes reported a strange encounter on Main Street, usually after the park has closed for the night. There was once a cast member who was pretty new to her job, and she'd kind of got a bit turned around on Main Street, figuring out which exit she needed to make it out to her car. So she stopped walking for a moment and just stood there alone, just like trying to find her bearings, figuring out which way to go. All of a sudden, someone behind her said, "Go left." And immediately she just thought like, oh, a colleague must have seen me out here. So she turned around and she was about to say like, oh, thank you. When she got a good look behind her, there was not a single living soul. Another cast member was working in Town Square after closing, cleaning up. He had headphones in and he was just listening to his music, just getting through his shift. Again, he was on his own when he started hearing a voice. So thinking that maybe another cast member was coming over to his area to join him or something, he just took his headphones off. And he could hear this voice, and he said it sounded like a man talking off in the distance, but he couldn't figure out what he was saying. All of a sudden, the voice just stopped dead. He did think it was pretty weird. He was supposed to be completely on his own, but he just put his headphones back on and carried on. Still has a job to do, still needs to work for his paycheck. But the male voice talking started up again. Again, he pulled his headphones off and looked around to see if he could see anyone at all who could be talking, but nothing, until he heard, clear as day, that same voice, which instantly sounded a lot closer now, say, "What?" This completely freaked him out. He still couldn't see anyone there around him, but the story ends there. I don't know what he did after that. I know exactly what I would have done. I certainly wouldn't be in Town Square on my own after that, I can tell you. But then there's this story, which is a little more well known. I saw it a few times during my research, and it said a cast member was washing down the walkways in Main Street. Again, like the other stories, he was completely on his own after closing, and he heard a voice over his shoulder, a man, clearly say, "You've missed a spot." He span round expecting to see a supervisor or something, but just like the others, there's absolutely no one there. Another woman who was leaving after a shift at 2 a.m. was walking across Main Street, again alone, when she started hearing the sound of a man humming, and the distinct sound of dress shoes echoing on the walkway behind her. Just like the others, she assumed it's got to be another cast member, right? When she turned around, what do you think she saw? That's right, absolutely nothing. And so because of these encounters and the many, many, many more just like it from other cast members over the years, it's thought that Walt Disney is still sometimes around on Main Street, helping out or providing constructive criticism to cast members who are still there past closing time. Although it's a fair point to mention here, sound can sometimes travel in weird ways, especially where buildings and angles are a bit weird. Sound can bounce off and amplify sometimes. Whether that's the case here, I don't know. Or maybe there is something to it. Mediums who have visited the park often say that they've seen Walt, with one saying that she usually sees him leaning against a lamppost by the Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln attraction, and he's smoking. So it seems like even if you're not on night shift and you're opening up bright and early for another sunny day at Disneyland, you may still potentially catch a glimpse of Walt. Especially if you're working in the Carnation Cafe on Main Street, because apparently this was one of Walt Disney's favourite spots. He used to have his breakfast here, and so now cast members will sometimes report that they see a figure of a man standing outside before they open up, waiting to be seated in the morning. When they go outside, there's no one there. Another residual echo from Walt Disney's routine in life, maybe? And that's not even the only eatery where his ghost has been seen, because the Golden Horseshoe seems to continue to be a frequent haunt of Walt's, pun intended. And I'm going to be coming back to the Golden Horseshoe restaurant in a later episode because there is a lot going on here. But it's got to mention here because it was another one of Walt's favourite spots in the park, because he loved the stage show. He loved it so much that he would stop in a couple of times a week and even had a favourite box, the one that sits stage left. And it was also the spot that Walt would apparently walk over to after his breakfast at the Carnation Cafe, so like about 7 to 8 a.m-ish, where he would smoke a cigar before the park opened. And so this story, it comes from a YouTuber called Alex the Historian, who I'll leave linked in the description because he has a bunch of stories about his time working there, as well as weird things that other cast members have reported too. But one night, as he was closing down in the Golden Horseshoe, he just so happened to look over at Walt's booth and noticed that the chairs weren't stacked up, because that was one of the jobs, like stack up the chairs, make it easier to clean the floors, like you get it. As he walked over, he noticed that one of the chairs had been pulled up to the railing and was facing outwards, as if someone had just been sat there enjoying a show on the empty stage. Thinking it was somewhat a little bit odd, but it's whatever, he stacked the chairs on the booth and carried on. But as he was walking away, he could hear a rustling sound coming from that booth, almost as if maybe one of the chairs was a bit uneven, and maybe it was possibly about to tip over or something like that. So he walked back to Walt's booth to find that the chairs had moved on top of the table, and that same chair had been moved back to looking out at the stage. Super weird now. Quite clearly someone, possibly Walt, is trying to send a message that he'd quite like to just sit sit and watch the show now, thank you very much. It's also not unusual for cast members who are setting up in the morning to get a whiff of cigar smoke, almost like Walt's enjoying that post-breakfast cigar once again. Alex the historian went on to say that some of the leads that he spoke to, they would arrive first thing and it was just normal, like it smelled how you would expect it to smell. But then as the morning went on, as they carried on setting up, the cigar smell would start wafting in with no explanation. It's not a smoking area and the park isn't even open yet, so it can't be a guest, just all around very strange. Walt does also seem to still be involved in some of the actual attractions too, with one of them being the railroad, because that was one of Walt Disney's passions outside of his work. He'd even built a miniature rideable train track in his back garden at Holmby Hills. And so the railroad at Disneyland was him taking this passion of his and scaling it up. He was very involved in the design and the operation of the attraction. But now, decades after his passing, some people have claimed to see a man wearing a conductor's hat and smoking a cigarette, walking on the tracks late at night. There has also been weird things reported with the railroad itself, because apparently if you're sitting in the train command centre late at night and you look up at this board, which during the day will show you like where all the trains are on the track, you'll sometimes see a train appearing on the board up in the far corner where it absolutely shouldn't be because there's no trains on the track. And the legend goes on to say that that's Walt's train. He's just taking it out for a spin while the park is closed. Elsewhere in the park though, Walt Disney also likes to make his presence known, including at what is potentially one of the most iconic areas of the entire park, the Sleeping Beauty Castle. There was once a paranormal investigator who had gained access to Disneyland after hours thanks to a cast member who was a friend, and so they were walking around when all of a sudden, right in front of them, just outside the castle, they saw an older man dressed in 1960s clothing standing on the drawbridge. The witness went on to say that the figure of the man looked at them and seemingly had some awareness about him, as he actually smiled and waved at them, and they were the only people there at the time. About 20 seconds after spotting him, he disappeared. But I mean, 20 seconds is still a decent amount of time, and she said that she was certain she would recognise his face anywhere. She had just seen the apparition of Walt Disney. And all of these cast members and guests, we're not just talking, oh, they all believe in ghosts and so they're kind of expecting, maybe even almost hoping to see the ghosts of Walt. Some of them were completely sceptical. Whether they still are afterwards, I'm not entirely sure. But there was a cast member who was cleaning below deck on the sailing ship Columbia late at night. And this particular cast member, he was a big burly guy, like I ain't afraid of no ghost kind of deal. So he was just down there on his own, he ain't scared of nothing, when all of a sudden, the hairs on the back of his neck start standing up. He was just starting to get a super uneasy feeling, but there's no logical reason why. He started looking around and kind of noticed a swirling mist thickening just in front of him. Still not scared, more just curious, he started walking towards this mist. As he got about 2/3 of the way there, the mist materialised into what he described as a young Walt Disney. Okay, now that's getting really weird. The cast member just stood, rooted to the spot, watching this figure as Walt just continued to stare at him until he vanished. Only then could the cast member carry on walking over to where he had just seen the young Walt Disney, but there was obviously nothing there, no explanation as to what he had just seen in front of him, nothing. Apart from the fact that this particular area was absolutely freezing cold, for no other reason other than, to this cast member, being something to do with what he had just seen. He was so completely freaked out by this that he just bolted and didn't finish his cleaning duties that night. But the Mark Twain riverboat is another boat that Walt Disney has potentially been seen in. Apparently, the figure of Walt has been seen sitting on a particular bench in the wheelhouse at the top of the Mark Twain, although I don't have any more specific details other than that. But the Mark Twain does seem to be a place where a lot of people, both cast members and guests, have again felt that presence of Walt Disney. But those aren't the only places that Walt has allegedly been spotted though. To be honest, it seems kind of more of like a where hasn't his ghost been spotted in the park? But anyway, here are more of the specific stories that I could find in no particular order. After closing one night, as a cast member was walking through the enchanted tiki room, they claimed to see the apparition of Walt standing in front of them, but that's all the information we've got. And a similar thing happened in the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. People have claimed to see Walt around that area, and we're going to be coming back to this particular ride in another episode later on, as there is a bunch more I want to say on that. But for now, the Dream Suite seems to also be another hotspot for people claiming to feel Walt in the room with them, and both cast members and guests who visit the Snow White Grotto have apparently seen his apparition in here. Allegedly, he's usually seen sitting on the ledge of the waterfall in between the two dwarves. And just like in so many other areas of the park, fresh cigarette smoke sometimes randomly appears with no explanation in the ultra-exclusive Club 33. But even those specific stories aside, so many people wrote online, said in videos or wrote in books that Walt Disney's presence can be felt all through Disneyland, which to me makes perfect sense. Disneyland was the real-life manifestation of Roy and Walt's company. It was bringing to life all of the magic and wonder that their audiences had been seeing on the big screen. Walt had a huge part to play in how the park eventually came to be be, how it was operated and what went where, and how guests would experience that magic of Disneyland. So just walking through the park on any given day can give you the feeling that Walt Disney is right there, walking alongside you in the happiest place on earth. But what do you think? Is Walt Disney still roaming the Anaheim park? Is he still peering over cast members' shoulders, saying hi to guests, and even checking out all of his favourite attractions? Or is there something else going on here? For me, I think that if the spirit of Walt Disney was going to come back, Disneyland would be the place that he would come back to. It made up a huge part of his life since way back in the 40s when the idea for the park was still forming, all the way through to his death. However, I think a lot of the reports that I found, if not almost all of them really, were very much sounding like just residual echoes, like the energy that Walt Disney exuded in life was imprinted on the places that he was most fond of, and so those echoes continued to repeat after his death. I think there could have been some of that going on there, because I do think that spending the amount of time at Disneyland that he did and pouring so much of yourself into a project like Disneyland, that's gonna leave some sort of energetic imprint, if that makes sense. That's what I believe. But also, I can't ignore the other side of that same coin, in that yes, Walt Disney spent a lot of time and energy making Disneyland the place that it is. So much of it reflects childhood memories and significant events and passions that Walt Disney had, that it almost feels like you've just stepped into the mind of the man himself. And so because of that, knowing what you already know about him, about Disney movies, about his apartment above the fire station, all of these things, it's gonna leave you that feeling like you can feel his presence, because paranormal or not, the park is a reflection of Disney himself. And then going even more skeptical, especially with the late night reports, you can't ignore the fact that when people are tired, your mind will play tricks on you, you might see things that aren't there, so that is also a point to consider. But please do let me know what you think. Is Walt still there? Is it just an echo from the time he spent in the park? I want to know your thoughts. And if you're just about to comment asking why I didn't cover some of the most famous ghost stories relating to Disneyland, don't worry, we're far from done. This is actually going to be my first 3-part series because there is so much to cover, and even then, that won't be everything. There are way too many reports of weird goings on at Disneyland to fit in. It seems to be one of the most haunted places I've covered so far. Who knew? And I am just talking about Disneyland here. I'm not touching any of the other parks, not even Disney California Adventure just yet. So if you're a fan of haunted Disneyland stories, definitely hang around for the next few episodes. They're good ones. But if you enjoyed this video, please do press the like button, and if you haven't already, maybe you'd like to subscribe. I cover loads of different haunted places, not just Disney, but we have a good time chatting about history and ghosts from all around the world anyway. So if that sounds like a bit of you, maybe you'd like to stick around? Up to you. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious, and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Because while Walt and his older brother, wow, that was hard. Because while Walt